and welcome to the February webinar. We thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. There will be a copy of the presentation in a files pod, which you will see when we shift over to our presentation mode here in a minute. At any time, you can enter a question into the Q&A pod, and those will be answered at the end of the presentation as time permits. If you are looking for CME today for participating, there will be an evaluation that you will receive an email after the webinar, generally the next day, and those certificates will be mailed to you within 10 business days. So today our topic is phishing, avoiding the hook. And this presentation is going to be brought to you by Kathy Bryant, TMLT Manager of Cyber Consulting Services, and Tony Pasalacqua will be joining her. He is a TMLT Cyber Consulting Services consultant. Just a quick disclosure about CME here, let you know that Tony and Kathy do not have any financial relationships with any ineligible companies, that this is just purely for your information and it's not legal advice. And your feedback, as we mentioned, will be important to us in that CME evaluation that you'll receive in an email at the end of the presentation or in the next day or so. You'll get that as well. So today, Tony and Kathy will be leading you through defining what phishing is and how it can affect medical practices, explaining the role of workplace education in combating phishing attempts, and offering some information on how to develop a phishing incident response plan. So at this time, I will turn it over to Kathy and Tony.
Thank you, Cassie. So I know a lot of physicians and practice managers out there always ask themselves, why is healthcare a target? So one of the main things is that you do have a lot of valuable assets that are attached to your business, such as social security numbers, credit cards, insurance information, and a lot of these things are crucial for threat actors to gain access to identity fraud or other sorts of criminal activity. Um, what this will do is it allows these threat actors to kind of get into your system, and their whole goal is to try to identify some different vulnerabilities that are out there. And this was going to allow them to be able to gain access into your systems and then gain access to that information for them to use at a later time. So, the top 5 cybersecurity threats to healthcare organizations is email phishing attacks, ransomware attacks, loss of theft and equipment or data, accidental or intentional data loss, and attacks against connected medical devices that may affect patient safety. So we sometimes see this with blood pressure cuffs or infusion pumps that are connected to your system. So to kind of understand this next component here, you're going to want to think about, how are these cyber criminals going to gain access to your systems? The main focus that a lot of them use is something called social engineering. That is the art of manipulating people so that they give up confidential information. The main ways that we see this is through phishing. Those are usually attacks that are done through email. Phishing, which is done through either making phone calls or leaving voicemails. And then SMS phishing or smishing, which is the use of text messages. Now, we do have some examples of these a little bit later on for you guys to kind of see. So, what is phishing? So, phishing is a social engineering scam whereby intruders seek access to your personal information or passwords by posing as a real business or organization with legitimate reasons to request that information. So, what's the main goal? So, the main goal is to trick the recipient into taking the attacker's desired action. And then by clicking on these specific links or attachments, that allows hackers or threat actors to gain access into your system. 91% of malware attacks come from phishing attempts using different variations of social engineering techniques. So, there's quite a few out there. An interesting study from 2018 is that 24% of physicians fail to identify phishing emails. So a question we sometimes get is, how does phishing work? So it's a complete cycle. One of the main things is that it always starts with the attacker. From there, they're going to create some sort of spear phishing email that they think is going to be able to compromise a user. As they send that phishing email, the goal is to try to get it through different layers of security. So the two major ones that we're going to talk about here is a firewall. That's the first layer that usually they have to try to get through, and then the second one is antivirus or spam. Once it gets through both of those layers there, it gets to a compromised user who may be able to identify a phishing email or may not be able to identify the phishing email. If they don't and they click on a link, what happens next is that sensitive information, such as login information, so they'd be usernames, passwords, or it could just be access to the network as a whole, gets sent back to a proxy or server that the cyber criminals usually have access to. And then from there, they have access to your sensitive information and they can do with it whatever they'd like to. In some instances, we'll see the information get encrypted. When that occurs, that's usually ransomware. And then in other instances, they'll take that information and sell it on the dark web. So how to recognize phishing. So you want to look for anything that looks out of place. So misspelled words is a great first key. Hyperlinks that are long or lead to a site that does not necessarily match up with what that hyperlink or hypertext says that it leads to. And then attachments such as docx, Excel, or PDFs. So one of the things that we have seen in the past is that they'll embed malicious code into Excel sheets, documents, or PDFs. And so that makes it real easy for you to click on it. You won't actually see a program load in the front, right? So this is all happening in the back, so you actually won't see most of this. So changing the tone of the email, this can be overly relaxed or outside the characteristics of a sender. I have seen examples on myself personally where individuals are very professional, but then I get this really relaxed email. That would be kind of an example of a change in characteristics. And then the tone of the email causing any sort of distress. That's a huge thing that we see a lot of. So they'll say anything from, you need to click on this link immediately. It's for your security. Or if you don't click on this link immediately, we're going to lock your account. Those are some huge things that we see that cyber criminals use to their advantage, especially from a social engineering perspective. So it all starts with an email. So this is really important. The first step is once they can get a phishing email to you, this is going to allow them to kind of work their way through different areas inside of your system. So this could be anything from access to your network, introduction of malware, a ransomware attack, and sometimes they can even get into your email servers. And from there, they can actually monitor who you're communicating with.
So, one of the biggest next steps after a phishing attack is the threat actor actually launching ransomware. Ransomware is a form of malware, which basically, once they are in your system and they decide it's time to launch the ransomware, it goes through a process where it encrypts all your files. And suddenly you no longer have access to your own records. That can be everything from your protected health information in your EHR, all the way down through your billing records, your financial records. We've talked about encryption a lot, as in it's a good thing to protect yourself. This is the similar type of process, but you don't have the key to open the door and access the data again. So we learned a lot when we look forensically at an attack that has happened. And here are some lessons that have been learned from forensic attacks, or I'm sorry, from ransom attacks. First, the threat actor gains uh, access to your network. That's usually because of phishing, as Tony has said. There are other ways that they can get in as well. For quite some time, open RDP ports were a huge ad- uh, vulnerability that the threat actors took advantage of, as well as good old fashioned hacking, which actually takes a lot longer. And so there may actually be uh, the the hack I'm sorry, it takes longer, and so it's not as easy for the threat actor to carry out. Next, the threat actor is in your network and they can just lay there and watch your activity for months on end. Um, they can actively snoop around in your network. They can look at your patient records. They can look at financials. They can see your physician credentials, DEA numbers, employee files, social security numbers, and other personal data can be uh, potentially looked at. By the time the threat actor has been in your network for a while, they've been watching everything that's going on, especially watching your backup system and process, because they want to know whether or not you are a good candidate for paying a ransom attack. Once they make that decision that they're fairly confident that you're going to pay the ransom if they launch the ransom attack. They simply launch the attack. And in many cases, ransom payments must be made by the practice to recover their data. Now, one thing I want to make sure you understand is just because you pay the ransom, number one, that is not a guarantee that you're always going to get all your data back. They're not necessarily the best, most honest people in the world if they're coming in and infiltrating your network. The second thing is simply because you pay the ransom and the threat actor gives you the key, sometimes it takes a very long time to get all your data recovered. Imagine coming into your office on a typical morning, and instead of being able to log in, you basically are greeted with, "Good morning, your network is unavailable." Now, this isn't going to be a literal message, but this is probably going to be the person who logs in, normally the first person in the office. And they may try everything they can think of, rebooting, all those things, and they're still unable to gain access. In this particular case, this was a practice that came in on a Monday morning and found this notice. Uh, they did not see the ransom notice, as Tony had said. Sometimes it's hidden. Their IT actually found the ransom notice on an internal server. The practice was really confident, though, that they had good backups because they actually had multiple copies of their backup that they rotated every day, and the copies were kept offsite. They had not ever had their IT do a test restore from backup. That they were going on blind faith that their backup system was working. In fact, what they discovered after trying multiple attempts to recover from backup is that the backups had been failing. Even though they got an email every day saying your backup was completed, it had not actually written any new data to the backup process for 18 months. Certainly not a time period that you could reasonably go back and say, well, I'll just redo my notes. If it was just one day, you might could do that, but certainly not 18 months worth. Ultimately, the decision was made to pay the ransom in order to hopefully regain their data, which they did. However, as I said earlier, this does not happen immediately. Several weeks actually passed before all their data was restored. And this particular practice came up with several creative ideas that I thought I would share with you that might actually be helpful as you're considering what you would do in this situation. So, Not just their EHR was affected, their practice management system was not available. So they literally did not know who the next patient that was going to walk in the door was going to be and what they were there for. One of the staff members got the great idea to take a plain calendar, and whenever a patient called to cancel an appointment, they wrote that down. They knew they at least had one open time slot. They were basically developing a list of available appointments. Likewise, if a patient um, came in and made an appointment, they wrote it. So they were creating their list that they would ultimately have to re-enter when the the system became available again. The practice admin early on was thinking worst case scenario. And in order to continue seeing patients, she said, well, if we have to restart and rebuild everything from scratch, let's make sure we're getting demographics and everything we'll need to recreate these patients in a system. So they pulled out their paper demographic form and just explained to the patients that they were updating their computer files and that they needed a new demographic form as well as a copy of their photo ID and their insurance card. Literally, in the first few days, the office encounters were literally written on the back of this page because those are all again going to have to be entered into your EHR when you have access again. These are a couple of things that you might want to consider when you're adding or consider adding to your contingency plan. So, what should you do if you become infected with ransomware? The early years of ransomware, we would tell people just shut off the computer, get it turned off so it can't infect anything else in your network. What we've learned is that sometimes that simple act of turning off the computer actually destroys some of the forensic evidence. And more, we're not seeing this on a single PC or a single laptop. We're seeing it on servers and larger parts of the network that it's not really feasible to even try to power off. You need to notify your IT and ask them to help you isolate the affected devices. Obviously, if it's a server, they're going to be involved with that. Always, always, always remind your IT people, no matter how confident they are in their backups, not to wipe the backup, or I'm sorry, not to wipe the affected device or server because they're actually destroying forensic evidence. You want to immediately secure your backup. Notify your cyber insurance carrier. That is going to gain you access to all the professionals that need to help you sort through what needs to happen next. A breach coach is usually assigned early on. That breach coach can actually be an attorney. You'll also get access to that forensics team that is invaluable with ransom attacks. And most likely, you'll be asked to notify law enforcement, either the FBI or local law enforcement or both. One other form of social engineering that we are seeing on the rise is called cyber deception. It's also been called uh, computer fraud, computer fraud, or funds transfer fraud. Basically, this is where the cyber threat actor assumes the identity of the CEO or the CFO or someone of authority in the organization. They usually pick a person in finance that may or may not have been there very long, and they send them an email that has a very relaxed tone. Hey, I'm out of the office for today. I promised this new vendor XYZ that we would pay their invoice. Be on the lookout for an invoice from them. No need to get any further approval uh, for the transfer. I'll sign off everything when I'm back in the office tomorrow. Employee wants to do a good job. They want to follow what the CFO or the CEO is asking. They make the funds transfer, and that money is basically lost because they voluntarily paid this incorrect invoice. One of the things you will want to do is to establish a policy on how you approve electronic funds transfers. You should always call the recipient to verify where they want the funds sent if it's a new electronic funds transfer. And if you cannot verify it that way, then someone like the CEO, the CFO, someone high in the authority in the organization needs to make that decision and not leave it up to staff. So, what can you do? We really want you to have an educated workforce. I think we probably say this in every webinar, but an educated workforce really is your first line of defense. You're going to educate them on phishing awareness. You're going to test them with phishing or smishing or vishing simulations or testing. You want them to be suspicious of unsolicited phone calls, visits, or emails. Staff should know never to provide personal information or information about the organization to someone over the phone or by email. You want to pay attention to the URLs of any hyperlink or any website that you're being directed to. And you want to make sure your technical safeguards, your antivirus, anti malware software is up to date, your endpoint protection, firewalls, and email filters. These are all parts to helping reduce the net or the traffic.
All right. So some of the most common phishing email subjects that we've seen. So fake invoice scams, email account upgrade scams, advanced fee scams. Google Docs is a new one we're starting to see a little bit more as everyone's starting to transition more to the cloud. It's just a very easy, accessible way to share large documents. PayPal scams, we've actually seen a couple of those. We'll show you guys one in just a few minutes here. Messages from HR. That's a scam that we usually see around the start of the year, especially like with W-2s going out and things like that. Dropbox is another common one, and then unusual activity scams. Those are kind of the big ones that we're seeing right now. All right, so as we promised, there's going to be a couple examples here. We're going to give you just a few seconds to kind of hit yes or no. There's a poll on the bottom right-hand corner for yes or no. And our goal is to have you kind of look at it and you want to kind of make a quick judgment call if it is or is not a phishing email. All right. So here's our first one. So Windows has detected suspicious activity. Kathy, did you want to kind of walk us through this one? Do you think it is or is not a phishing email based on that warning there?
Sure. So the first thing to realize is that you may just get a pop-up of something like this when you're on a website or on the internet. So this doesn't necessarily have to come in the form of an email or a text message. So that would be the first thing I would kind of be suspicious about. It definitely is creating that sense of urgency, warning you not to turn off your computer, warning you there's going to be a bad outcome if you don't follow their instructions. Um, they even tell you, here's how you fix it. You give us a phone call. They're going to ask you to provide information about the practice, or they may even request that you give them remote access through any kind of program that they choose. So I would say this is phishing, and almost everyone got that one right.
Perfect.
The next is um, one, Tony, for you to walk through about your iCloud account has been limited.
All right. So, well, I mean, it can't be phishing, Kathy, because it's an iCloud account, and we all know that Apples are inherently more secure, right? And so that's what a lot of these individuals are kind of looking for. So, one of the first questions I always ask myself is it normal for a company to reach out to me? So, we see it with like Microsoft, we see it with Apple and some of the other ones. If they're reaching out to you to tell you that there's something that's going on with your account, there's a really good chance that it could be phishing. Um, the next thing here is that it's trying to create a sense of urgency. So iCloud account is limited for security reasons. Anyone who's used Apple's, we can all tell you that you're very dependent upon your iCloud account. So if they tell you it's going to be limited for security reasons, that's going to create that sense of urgency that we're looking for. There's a generic greeting that always kind of raises a red flag for me personally, because it means that potentially when the individuals are trying to do a phishing campaign on me, they may not know who I am. And so just a generic, dear customer account, and then having that specialized information above, that should kind of draw some, you know, it should raise a couple of red flags for you. And then the credible warning, some of the things that we're looking at here is that it's incorrect. So avoid the closure of your account. So please sign in to your Apple ID. So it's not just hyperlinks and hypertext that we're looking for. These little buttons that you see, sign in and review, kind of below that Apple logo, that's something that you're also looking at as well. Those are actually the same thing as a hyperlink. It's just fancier looking. So just think of it that way. And then it's still reinforcing that, we are going to disable your account for security reasons. So again, creating that sense of urgency throughout this entire email. If you hover over that, it has a HTTPS www.icloud.com and /redirect. Just as users that are out there, that last backslash that you're looking at, it may or may not make sense to you, but usually those are tabs within a web page, right? So I've never seen a redirect tab, so it would raise a question for me, and I would flag this one as a phishing attack. Okay. All right. So, looks like you're out of state like storage. So here's a Dropbox example. Kathy, can you kind of go through this one and give us some ideas if this one is actually a phishing attack or if it's legitimate?
Sure. So the first, you look at who it's from. No reply from dropboxmail.com. I personally have a Dropbox account, and so I would say it sure looks legitimate. It looks like the emails I get from Dropbox. Um, but it is kind of creating a sense of urgency that I'm out of storage. I thought I paid a lot of money for a lot of storage with Dropbox. How can I be out of storage? So it's starting to be a little questionable. Then at the very bottom, it sort of changes the tone. We go from that sense of urgency to happy Dropboxing. And so that's really going to make me wonder, is this legitimate or is it not? And again, like Tony was showing you, you can hover over all the things that are hyperlinked, either the button. You can look at all the different places that they have hyperlinked in the email. And all of these look very legitimate. So overall, I would say that this is not phishing. So Tony and I both have been getting a lot of text messages that are kind of suspicious. This was actually early one morning a few days ago, and I had these three text messages waiting for me when I got up. The first two really caught my eye because I was pretty sure I'd slept that night and I hadn't been on Amazon shopping at 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning to get notice that my Amazon account was on hold. Uh, so I really thought those two were suspicious. The third one, this one's so old, I don't know why people are even still trying it, but I guess it's desperate times or something. It's time to go on a road trip. Enter for a chance to win a $500 gas card. I always tell people that, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And I would just avoid that totally. So let's look a little deeper at an example of SMS texting or phishing or SMS smishing, sorry, smishing um, attempts. So the first thing that comes to my mind is that there's all sorts of misspelled words uh, up in the very top. It is creating a sense of urgency in that it's saying that your account is on hold, but this one's subtle. PayPal, in all their official information, PayPal is two separate words, not one. So that's in and of itself is a hint. And this particular text message came to an iPhone, and Apple has even added this warning at the bottom that the sender is not in my contact list. And do I want to report it as junk? I think everyone is realizing there is so much of um, an attempt to get into people or get people's information. They're making all sorts of accommodations to make it easy to actually report these as junk. So I would say that is definitely, oops, sorry, I forgot to pull the poll in. Here, we'll give you an easy one. Uh, that is definitely a smishing. Anything else you see on that one while we give everybody a couple of seconds to?
No, well, I mean, interesting thing that I'm starting to see is, and you may see this on Androids or iPhones, is that they are starting to make it easier for you to unsubscribe to emails that you're getting or to report things as junk. Uh, just for a lot of the attendees that are out there, that kind of goes back to that spam filter. The more that you click on report as junk, as long as it's a legitimate link for your platform that you're using, that's helping to flag those fraudulent emails or those phishing emails, and it'll continue to beef up your spam filter on the other end, so less of them get through. So, so here's kind of one of my favorite things. We do get this question sometimes, which is, well, how do you know if your email or username has been part of like a potential data breach? So we have found this specific site here. It uses a database of essentially breached uh, companies or breach software, and it pulls it all into one big giant database. And so you punch in your email address, usually personal or professional, and you can see if that is actually pulling in as a potential data breach. So I have personally done this, and to be quite frank, I was surprised to find out that the majority of the breaches that occurred underneath some of my really old emails, I've never received any notification, nor did I know I was part of. So it's just kind of an interesting way to maintain some cyber awareness of what accounts may have been potentially breached. Another really interesting thing is that in some instances, it's not just your username that's been breached, it's sometimes even your passwords as well. So if that's the case and you've been using the same password on other accounts, you would want to immediately change that. So it just turns into another cyber awareness kind of training. So are you catching the fish and how would you respond? So one of the big things that we're looking at from our side is, do you have a plan for who you would contact if you suspected any sort of phishing emails or if you clicked on the link? It gets the best of us all at some point. So the big thing is do you have an internal IT team that you can contact? So depending on the size of your organization and exactly what you have access to, sometimes you have like a phishing button that's kind of attached into your email. You can click on that, and that sends it and flags it to your IT department. Your IT department at that point can kind of open that up in a what they call a sandbox. So it's an area that is contained, so it will not cause any sort of malware to be downloaded into your networks. And sometimes you get that same kind of service too from some of these external IT vendors. And then some of the other questions to ask is, do you have an incident response team for IT, right? So we think a lot of the times about it from the medical side of, what happens if something goes wrong? Here's our list of codes, right? And then you have for each one of those codes a specific response. So you would want to have kind of the same thing for your IT as well. What that is going to do, it's going to help out with like a quick response. Sometimes what you may see is if an emergency occurs and you don't have an incident response team, everyone's kind of left trying to figure out what's our plan, and that's where you want to have those plans set in place before the incident occurs. So those are the big things that we're kind of looking for just on the phishing side. So incident response requirements, there is requirements set by the HIPAA security rule. So you want to just make sure that you've developed and implemented a data backup plan. That's huge. Develop a disaster recovery plan. Develop an emergency mode of operations. So if you have limited capacity, it could be anything from utilities going out like internet or power. Develop and implement procedures for testing and revision of plans, and then perform an application and data criticality analysis. Okay, so contingency plans are probably one of my favorite topics. The goal of a contingency plan is to allow organizations to return to daily operations as quickly as possible after an unforeseen event. If there's anything that we have noticed over the last few years is that there's lots of unforeseen events that can come up at any time. We've seen anything from ice storms, a pandemic, and a lot of those things have forced organizations to create contingency plans. The best thing now is to kind of go through and write your contingency plans down and then analyze them, at least annually or after an event to make sure that it's still meeting everything that you need. So some of the big things that we look for that are good to have contingency plans for is fires, floods, and cyber attacks. Those are the three big ones.
So, what can you do now before something happens? I suggest that you get everybody from, or at least one person from every area, and sit down over lunch, order pizza, whatever, um, and go through a scenario. If you came into work on Monday morning and you could not access your EHR, what would you do? Start with the person that's usually the first person in the door on Monday morning and go through and discuss each department or each area, what they would do and how they would respond. Then, after you've thought about it for a little bit, you're going to have to ask the question, could we see patients that morning? And if the answer is yes, then what paper tools or what are you going to need to be able to see those patients? And where would you find it? I always talk about developing a computer crash cart. I don't care if it's a cardboard box or some sort of fancier filing box, but you should put one or multiple copies, depending on which way you want to go and how available your copy machine would be. But you want to put copies of all the forms in there so that you will have something to work from to be able to see those patients. It may be something as simple as that demographic form that we showed you earlier in the presentation. You might also think about, how am I going to order medications? If everything um, everything's done electronically through my EHR, how am I going to write a prescription? How are you going to order labs? How are you going to order imaging, especially if it's done with an outside party? Because you often probably just send that through your EHR. So think through all of those things ahead of time. Just a checklist of a few tips to remember is develop that contingency plan and get it down on paper. It should start with an emergency contact list. You should know who all the key players in the organization are. You should know IT, you should know your EHR, all those different things that you will potentially have to be notifying. You want to also keep that in paper form because if your Outlook is down, then you may not be able to get to your normal phone numbers. You want to also encourage other key staff to keep that page with them away from the office because this could happen in the middle of the night. You could become aware of an issue. And so, again, you would want to have that readily available. You want to develop that computer crash cart that I talked about just a few moments ago. You want to practice those downtime procedures. I would love to think you'd practice them at least once a quarter, but if you can get them at least once a year, you're better than a lot of other practices. Know your backup plan and make sure IT is testing can they restore from that backup. And the last one is in the worst case scenario that there is a security incident, take lots of good notes. What we find in post event follow ups is the better notes you have, the easier it is to answer OCR investigations, better it is to help forensics and everyone else involved in the evaluation to determine is this a reportable breach. The FBI has been warning since 2014 that healthcare needs to be prepared for ransom attacks. They keep saying it's not a matter of if, but rather a matter of when we will have a ransom attack. And you want to do that by uh, knowing how to prepare, react, and recover from ransomware. Not unlike any other kind of cyber related presentation that we've done, especially those that involve protected health information, there are consequences to successful phishing attacks, successful ransom attacks. In many cases, these are reportable breaches to the Office of Civil Rights, the federal government. And in many cases, that will open an investigation. It's going to take time away from patient care. There could be a financial impact as well as reputational harm from just the fact that the world is going to know you've had an issue. And last but not least, there could be fines and penalties as you move forward.
Well, thank you, Kathy and Tony, for bringing this presentation to us today. Some really great information. Just as a reminder, if you weren't on at the beginning, you can download a copy of the presentation on the download files pod at the bottom left of your screen. Also, if you're interested in the CME, there will be an evaluation that you will receive in a follow-up email, and then you can look to receive those certificates in about 10 business days. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box. We do have time for a few questions here. So the first question, Kathy and Tony, do antiviral like Norton or McAfee detect and warn of phishing?
You want me to take that one?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So it really depends on the software that you're purchasing. So, I mean, it's a great question because the way that I kind of used to look at it is if you're purchasing an antivirus software, they must all be the same. But one of the best things to do is to get online and either call the customer support and just ask them because there are specific programs that will scan things in advance, but you sometimes have to enable those features. And in other instances, it may be something that's not included with that software, and you may have to buy the next subscription or package up. So it's one of those that really just depends. You just have to kind of double check with the customer service.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Question: Cyber deception phishing attempts always by emails requesting that physician's direct deposit account be updated for payroll. They haven't done anything with it, but they're wondering if there are steps they should be taking to report emails that they get like this.
Um, I don't know of any official place to report them. Um, there are some organizations that you can report to. CISA is one that I'm thinking of, but I'm not sure how much, with all the volume of things that they're doing and dealing with right now, whether or not a single email would capture a lot. It would be something that you'd want to bring to the attention of your IT or whoever manages your email, because perhaps they can look at those and tighten some of the filters so that those are not getting through as much.
Great. With smishing text, it seems as though more pop-ups occur. Should we just delete those anyway with this if it's a suspicious text?
I
I think
know.
it's saying if you delete them that they seem to get more and more.
Correct.
Yeah. Sometimes that can be. So it's really interesting when you start kind of digging into how the dark web works. Once your information gets out there and they know, hey, this is a phone number that's a legitimate phone number, they'll start sending text messages to it. In some instances, if you're deleting those messages, there's a good chance that it's not being sent back to them. But it just may mean that someone said, "Hey, this is a legitimate phone number," so just keep pushing SMS attacks to those, and then eventually, hopefully, they'll click on it. A lot of the SMS attacks that they're using, it's really about trying to catch you at an opportunistic time. So, for instance, we saw a lot with like DHL for a while there or FedEx, and they said click on the link to see where your package is at. I have almost personally fallen victim to one of those because I ordered something and it says that it's coming through UPS, and then within about 10 seconds of that, I received like an SMS text saying, "Hey, here's your tracking." I didn't click on it, luckily, but in most instances, most people would. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily going to add more. I think it just means that they know it's a legitimate number and you're just going to continue to get those messages. The best thing to do is just delete them.
And I think if you delete them before you open them, it's
Yes.
better than, we actually showed you two different examples, the ones that had not been open and then the one that had been open. Um, so if at all possible, make your decision from that little summary screen that you see and not open it to make that decision.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Android users, if there's anyone out there, you can just click and hold on it and then delete it. So I mean, I just received another SMS attack this morning at 8:13. So they are really prevalent right now. So just stay vigilant is the best advice I can give.
So if email on phone is on the cell phone, sometimes it looks as though it's different on a desktop. Is there a difference in phishing emails that are directed only at a cell phone?
Go ahead, Tony.
It's a great question. I love it. So, believe it or not, there's different coding mechanisms between your desktop and how your desktop looks and your mobile phone. So, yeah, there are some differences in the way that they do look. Fabulous question. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions about if EHR is cloud-based, what questions should they be asking about backups and how that should be handled? It's a rather broad question, but maybe you can touch on it just a little bit.
I think that's a really great question because with more and more people going to the web-based EHRs, it is important to um, know how the EHR vendor is backing up your data. And you have every right to ask, how is my backup being protected? How often do you test restore from backup? If your system goes down, how long is it going to take you to get me back up and running? Because you're going to be totally at the mercy of the vendor at that point, because however long it takes them to get back up and running and then restore their customers, that's going to be variable. There was an EHR vendor that was attacked a few years ago, and there was a practice here in Texas that was down for 9 days. I don't think most EHR vendors are putting in guaranteed uptime uh, in their contracts, because I think they're just all too scared to do that anymore. But that was a um, opportunity for them to give you some assurance. But you can certainly ask about their backup systems, their backup processes, and that's great documentation for you to have should there ever be an event that you ask those questions proactively.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Tony, you had answered the question about those smishing attempts on your cell phone, and you mentioned about deleting. This question is in reference to blocking it. Should you block the phone number as well and then delete that message?
I do. I think that it you're going to get different feedback from that depending on who you talk to. So sometimes the the phone numbers that are coming in, they can be auto generated. This is so they have thousands of them. So I mean, if they want to, they can just keep kind of bombarding your phone. I personally block them because after a while, I'm like, okay, well, I've eliminated that from their list. So now they're going to have to continue to use theirs, and eventually, hopefully, I can get every phone number on their list, and then I don't have to worry about any more SMS attacks. So that's how I do it. And then I never open up the links. I don't even hover. I don't check anything. I'm just immediately label it. Like the one I was telling you guys about at 8:13, that was an Amazon. Your account's been locked, and I know for sure it's not. So, it one of the other tricks to do is if you do get something and you're kind of suspicious of it, I'm a huge fan of going directly to the website. So if it's like PayPal or Amazon or any of those other locations, don't ever click on those links inside of the box, even if you think it is legitimate. Just delete it, and then you can always go to that site and log in directly. Um, there's this thing called a man in the middle attack, which is where you click on the link and the link will take you to something that looks exactly like the login page. And what happens is when you log in there and you put your username and password, that's going to actually cause them to be able to capture that. And then it goes into like a spreadsheet would be the easiest way to explain it. And then now they have your username and your password without having to do any hacking at all. So it's all social engineering, just using behaviors. And then the neat thing is from there, they can take you and send you to the legitimate website, put your credentials in, and then you log in as if nothing ever happened. So it's just one other way that they can attack your stuff. So hopefully that answers your question. Sorry.
Perfect. Thank you, Tony. For if you do use the website that you guys mentioned about an email being cloned, what do you recommend about fixing it if you do find that your email has been found on one of those lists?
The first thing you want to do is go to the legitimate website. So if it were your, just say, Amazon account, go to Amazon and change your password. The other thing I would recommend is not reusing passwords. I mean, in the beginning, didn't we all do that? Let me come up with a nice password that I can remember. And so all of my online shopping, I'm going to use the same password for. That's a big no no now, because that's just opening up more and more of your accounts if you do reuse your password. The other thing is you don't want to save your passwords in your browser for all sorts of reasons. But if there were ever anyone that was able to gain access to your device and you had saved your passwords in your browser, they're going to have access to those. So just keep those things in mind, that strong passwords or even very long passcodes is sort of another thing to think about. Individual for each individual account are very important.
Mhm.
There are even some of the password keepers and different kinds of software out there that will randomly generate a new password every time you have to access an account. So just look into some of the technology. There are helpful things out there.
Mhm. Yeah, and just to kind of jump on the password bandwagon. So, I mean, I don't know if anyone's aware of this or not, but if there is a word in a dictionary, regardless of language, if there's anything in there, those have already been added into what they call a like a brute force attack. So if it is a dictionary word, any language, more than likely it's hackable. So you really kind of want to shift towards something more like passphrases. That's a big one. Or a lot of people will use acronyms as well, as long as the acronyms do not spell a word, right? So just some pointers and tips there.
You guys anticipated a question about passwords as someone was asking, what's the best way to store those and keep up with them? Because everyone in healthcare knows there are a lot of passwords to maintain.
Yeah.
So
You want me
there are things called password keepers. There's lots of different ones. You want to look for ones that have a very high level of encryption, but unfortunately, they're like any other software. They can be hacked. So use them with caution. Um, do I think I personally prefer a a electronic software or password keeper as opposed to having a piece of paper that I keep in my briefcase or my wallet with my passwords written down on it, because I think my wallet is probably a lot easier to lose than access to an electronic password keeper.
Mhm.
Great. And one final question. I know we're getting close to time here. Another question about passwords. If you feel as though your password is compromised, what should you do in that instance?
Change it immediately. Uh, no questions asked. Even if you kind of get like that, it could be or may not have been. If you change it, you'll never regret it because the way that it kind of works, and this is how I look at it is your password's kind of like if like it's like a fuse, right? So if you have an easy password, it's a short fuse, and it takes them just a small amount of time to break into it. If you have a longer password, that's going to be a little bit more difficult for them to get to. Like 8 to 12 characters is kind of what a lot of the suggestions are, and as long as you're kind of hitting that range there, your fuse is longer, right? So if you think your password is getting close to being compromised, or it could be hacked, then you just change your password and that whole process starts all over again. It'll drive threat actors completely crazy, because as they're thinking they're getting closer and you change your password, it resets the whole process for them. So now they have to be faster at it each time. Eventually, the goal is to make yourself less of an opportunistic target so that they move on to someone else who's easier. So that's usually what kind of happens with a lot of these threat actors.
Perfect. Well, guys, I know we're getting close to time and we want to be respectful of our end time. Any final thoughts from Kathy or Tony? We've gone through most of our questions here.
We know all of you have lots of questions, and everyone comes up on a new day, a new question. Just want to encourage you to remember cyber at tmlt.org. We're more than happy to try to help you work through individual questions. Please don't send us potential phishing emails. I would ask you not, we're not set up to be able to check those for is it safe to open that document or not. But if you have a general question, uh, please feel free to reach out to us.
Hmm.
Perfect. Well, great, guys. Thank you so much, Kathy and Tony, for joining us. Thank you, participants, for joining in today. We hope you found the information valuable. And again, if you're looking for CME, you can look for that email as well as a follow-up email with the recording from today's presentation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.